Honourable Martin Aldridge.
Mr. President, it is with great trepidation that I stand here tonight, delivering my first speech to this place. Not because this is my first speech, but because I stand here tonight knowing that the people of my region have charged me with a great privilege and responsibility to serve them in this place. I would like to extend my gratitude to you, Mr. President, and the parliamentary staff who have made me feel so welcome since my election on the 5th of April. Nothing has been too much trouble, and the wise counsel that has been offered has been very beneficial in these first few weeks. I'm the son of farming parents. I'm first-generation Australian. My parents are one of the rare few that spent their entire childhood growing up in Perth and then went on to make the bush their home and agriculture their living. I was born in Byford, Western Australia, in 1982. My parents at the time were working at a small piggery in the area. It was not long before my brother joined me the following year, and this young family headed for new opportunities in our wheat belt north of Merredin. My parents were young. We were by no means wealthy in a material sense, but my childhood was rich. My father worked 3 jobs, by day at the piggery and by night at either the local roadhouse or the steel fabrication factory. It was whilst we were in Merredin that my brother and I were joined by a sister. Some of my strongest childhood memories were of living there, in our small 5-row house with rainbow carpets, being entertained by Dad in the cool of the afternoon, being pulled behind the motorbike in our pedal carts. The pedals going that fast, I'm sure if we were to have put our feet near them, they would have broken our ankles or worse. Weekends spent on the farm dams catching julgies with the Gray family, lots of memories. It was when I was 7 that my family moved to Gingin. Gingin was very different to Merredin. It was greener, cooler place. We had a brook, the ocean was only half an hour away, and for the first time our family lived in a new but modest brick home. It was in Gingin that my siblings and I developed love for horses that my father had, and over the coming years we all had the pleasure of riding fine equine specimens from the free section of the Quokka. One thing is for sure, that after that baptism of fire we could ride any horse, or so my father would tell us. Gingin only had a district high school, so as year 11 approached, I faced the decision of heading to Perth for my senior high school education or to board in the country. I don't recall the decision taking me very long. I'd only known country life at this point, apart from the rare occasion when we would stay with our grandparents during the school holidays for swimming lessons in Perth. It was a decision that I remember making swiftly, but one that I've never regretted. Whilst my friends were off to start trade apprenticeships, attend schooling in Perth, or at agricultural colleges in Cunderdin or Morawa, I was heading to Central Midlands Senior High School in Mora. I boarded at the St James Residential College, along with about 40 other country kids from across the state. Mora was quite a change. Not only was it the first time that I was to live away from my parents, but it was the first time I'd had any interaction with Aboriginal people. Although Mora is only an hour up the road, or 2 hours if you were put on the Transwa bus on a Sunday afternoon, it was a vastly different community to the one I had grown up with. It wasn't until my last year of schooling in Mora that I learnt just how strong and resilient this community was. On the 20th of March 1999, 80 millimetres of rain fell within 6 hours within the Moore River catchment as a result of severe tropical cyclone Elaine. This in isolation may not seem that extraordinary, but after 2 days of relentless rain, it was enough to become a serious problem. Locals had seen the river rise and fall over the years, and there was nothing to be alarmed about as the river continued to rise on Saturday afternoon. By early Sunday morning, dogs were waking locals as water advanced into their backyards, and others awoke to knee-deep water already in their bedrooms. This town that I'd only known for a little more than a year amazed me. It didn't matter who you were, where you were from, or what task you got assigned to do, everyone just got on with it. Much of my class was shipped off to neighbouring schools to continue with what was to be their final TEE year, as the State Emergency Service set up operations in our high school. As the head boy of the senior high school, I could not return to my studies at this time. I felt that, like everyone else in the town, I had a responsibility to do my bit. Once the water had receded, I returned to town and began work setting up a relief centre in the school gymnasium. It was not long after that donations of clothing, food and cleaning equipment started rolling in from across the state, and it was my job to manage its collection and distribution. It was only a small task when you consider the enormity of the recovery effort, but one that I remain proud to this day to have done and played my part during those rough few weeks in this community. I'd been an emergency service volunteer before moving to Moora. However, I think it was my experience there that encouraged me to continue to serve my community. Returning home to the farm after completing Year 12, I commenced my university education by distance education whilst I worked for Mum and Dad. I became more active in my local fire brigade, and at the age of 18 was elected captain of my local fire and rescue service station. I was on a steep learning curve as my station had responsibility for two major highways, the Brand and the Great Northern. Shortly after, I was accepted into the Career Fire and Rescue Service. I would spend the next 6 years as a career firefighter, most of which would be served at Belmont Fire Station. It was a great job, but even greater were the people I worked with, who became my extended family. We shared our ups and downs together, and I've made lifelong friends from the time I spent on B Platoon, Belmont Fire Station. My involvement with politics commenced in a formal sense in the early 2000s. I was nervous about joining a political party. I don't come from an overtly political family, however, I'd hazard a guess that they were traditionally Conservative voters. My family had no connection with the Nationals. I hesitated. What am I signing myself up for, I thought. It was not long after I received a phone call from Darren Moyer, the president of the Young Nationals at the time. He sounded normal, apart from calling me Tiger and the odd tickety-boo thrown into conversation. From a farm in Borden, not much older than I was, all of a sudden it wasn't so scary after all. There was a good group of Young Nationals at the time when I joined, which probably had the greatest influence on me. The Honourable Brendan Grills, Mia Davies, Michael Rose, Daniel Spillman, Joe Hawksley, and of course Darren, to name a few. We were more of a social club of country kids that would get together a few times a year, have a beer and knock some ideas around. We were encouraged along by some of our more senior members, like the late John Saint and party stalwart Marjorie Green, who backed us young ones, including our controversial civil unions motion at our state conference. It was a great time to be involved. Our party was on the cusp of change, a new leader, new policy, and rejuvenation in our party's base that reflected the changing landscape that is regional politics. The Honourable Grant Woodhams and the Honourable Murray Criddle had a great influence on my being in this place today. It was these two gentlemen that encouraged me to achieve what not that long ago I thought was impossible. Both have been outstanding representatives for regional Western Australia, and I acknowledge their contribution tonight. It was this time last year that I was preparing for my second pre-selection after having contested this same region in 2008, fourth on the Legislative Council ticket for the Nationals. Our parliaments need a mix of people to make them fully representational of our electors, and whilst that includes ethnicity, gender and background, I also believe that one's age is an important factor that political parties need to consider. If there was just one thing our small political party cannot be criticised for, that is its encouragement of younger people and women to become involved in politics. Whilst I was not active in the party at the time that the Honourable Brendan Grills was first pre-selected to contest the seat of Merredin at a by-election, I understand he was not the natural choice in a field of much more experienced candidates, and I'm sure there were similar rumblings within the party at the time about this energetic young man from the farm near Corrigan that had upset the pre-selection process and won. On many occasions I've reflected over the last 12 months on the advice provided to me at the time by the Honourable Brendan Grills, and that was have faith and trust in the members of our party, as they have not got this wrong before. I hope that I honour the trust and faith that those party members have placed in me, in my service for my electorate over the next 4 years. I often reflect on the contemporary political debates with my peers that surround vexed issues and wonder if there will be a point in time in which we look back and wonder, what was all that about? Why did it take us so long to get there? Generational change is real, and that means that the values and beliefs of each generation are different. If you accept my argument that each generation has differing values and beliefs, then how can this place be truly representational until we have a much broader cross-section of the community represented here? With half of the region's voters aged 44 or less, How do we challenge younger people to seek office in this place? I hope that I'm able to connect with my region's young people and help restore some of the trust and respect that was once associated with political life. Too often politics gets in the way of good policy. I'm sure I'll be guilty of it too at some stage. However, some issues are just too important for us to accept failure. One matter that is close to my heart is the protection of firefighters, both career and volunteer. Tonight, as I deliver my first speech to this place, firefighters employed within Commonwealth jurisdictions at our airports and our defence facilities have a far superior level of protection than those employed by the state or engaged as volunteers. Fire protection in this state, and in fact all states of Australia, are predominantly delivered by volunteers. In Western Australia, the volunteer fire service numbers more than 30,000 in comparison to 1,000 career staff. An incident tonight at Perth Airport would trigger a massive response by fire agencies, including those employed at Perth Airport and those stationed around Perth within the Fire and Rescue Service. Whilst these Commonwealth and state firefighters work alongside each other, the protections offered by the state to our career and volunteer personnel remain inferior. In 2011, the Federal Parliament, off the back of a Senate committee findings, strong scientific evidence and action globally, moved to protect firefighters by passing rebuttable presumptive legislation. This legislation reversed the burden of proof required from the employee to the employer and would assume that in the event of a firefighter contracting one of 12 prescribed cancers and them satisfying several criteria, including varying lengths of service for each cancer type, the presumption would be that the development of the cancer was as a result of their exposure to the hazards of firefighting. Firefighters and their families fighting a bout of cancer, some quite seriously, need to remain focused on their treatment and recovery, not worried about a legal battle with insurers or how their family may be able to survive financially should they lose that fight. I could talk extensively on this issue, and being conscious of time will not, just to say that this Parliament needs to address this inconsistency as a matter of urgency. The electorate that I represent in this place, the agricultural region, is some 200,000 square kilometres of Western Australia's finest country. To put that into some perspective, my electorate compares in size to the state of Victoria at 227,000 square kilometres. It stretches to Kalbarri in the north, to Merredin in the east, and to Bremer Bay on our south coast, adjoining the metropolitan area and the southwest region on the western boundary. The region has a great diversity in its local economic drivers, spread over a large geographic area. Making comparisons with the rich farming and viticultural areas of the Great Southern with the tourism and pastoral base of Kalbarri are often difficult. However, one strong factor transcends these communities, that is country people. Agriculture, including fishing and forestry, are the major sources of employment in the region and have been for the best part of the last century or more. Whilst all three of these industries have experienced fairly tumultuous times for various reasons over the last decade, I remain optimistic for their future. The production of food and fibre in Australia is one of our natural and economic strengths. At the risk of sounding cliché, the exponential growth of global population will inevitably place immense pressure on our environment and our ability to feed the world's people. I strongly suspect that in my lifetime, we will experience our markets more closely watching agricultural commodities in the same way that we seem to be so fixated on gold and oil today. I've spent the entirety of my early years growing up on a farm. My partner's parents are farmers from Jataning near Coolin, and I come from a region that derives much of its wealth from agriculture. I think I'm close enough to my community to understand the challenges facing the sector, not only in the agricultural industry, but in small business more generally. In a recent radio interview on ABC News Radio, Mr. Steve Carroll, a director at the Australian Bankers Association, referred to Australian Bureau of Statistics figures released recently that showed 1% of agribusinesses having difficulty accessing finance in comparison to the average across all other industries of 7%. Whilst I don't intend to shift the focus from the challenges in agriculture as they are real, we must consider them in the context of other small businesses as they are similarly facing financial challenges. Mining is a growth industry and a major contributor to the region and the state. Whether it has been natural gas, mineral sands or iron ore, mining has been part of this region for many decades. It may have become more apparent in recent years with the proposed development of Okatchee Port and the magnetite projects planned for the Midwest and the Great Southern. However, this industry is by no means new to our region. Mining offers our communities the ability to diversify local economies, create local jobs, and provide for more sustainable growth. It is often claimed that agriculture cannot coexist with mining, a claim that I do not accept. We need both industries to remain strong for our communities to prosper. I often hear the statement repeated ad nauseum, "We can't eat rocks," in an attack on the mining industry. This narrow view fails to consider how important minerals such as iron ore are to our industrialised world. A scarcity in supply of iron ore and other minerals would undoubtedly place a pressure on agriculture, an industry that has mechanised and modernised by enormous proportions over the last 50 years. Competing land and water use amongst industry is not new and will continue to raise its head from time to time. Good planning and governance is needed to manage these competing interests. With the agricultural region bordering the Perth CBD on the north, east and southeast boundaries, there is enormous potential for tourism. The opportunities are too many to list fully. However, towns like Kalbarri, Jurien Bay, Lancelin, York, the Avon Valley, the Pinnacles, the Parongarups, and our vast array of national parks across our region offer great variety to tourism ventures and tourists alike. Royalties for Regions has invested heavily in tourism over the last 4 years, investment which I support and hope will continue in this term so we can continue to exploit the unique opportunities that our state offers and attract more interstate and international travellers. Often I hear the claim that young people are no longer calling the bush their home, moving to the big smoke for opportunities that no longer exist in the regions. The facts are something quite different. The agricultural region is home to some 137,000 West Australians, with 43% of them aged less than 34 years of age. I found that statistic quite astonishing when it was released in 2011 by the ABS. As governments scramble to meet the challenge of caring for the ageing in our community over coming decades, I hope we don't lose sight of the potential in our young people. They are innovative, educated, adaptive and prepared to meet the challenges of the future. This leads me to the next point that I wish to make this evening, and that is of volunteers. Having the majority of my extended family living in Perth, I'm convinced that for many West Australians, we take for granted the availability and provision of services in our regions, especially as they relate to essential and emergency services. We all expect that when we dial 000, help will be on its way. Not for 1 minute do I think that that is an unreasonable expectation. However, the majority of these responses, whether they be by the State Emergency Service, the Fire Services, St John Ambulance or the Marine Rescue Service, are by volunteers. I recognise that it's not viable for small country towns to have paid staff performing these functions for a range of reasons. The first being that as a state we could not afford it. There are more than 30,000 fire volunteers and 2,000 ambulance volunteers in this state alone. I think just about every regional community is being affected by dwindling volunteer numbers, and as a product of that, volunteer burnout is on the rise. According to the Department of Communities in the report, The Economic Value of Volunteering in Western Australia, and based on 2006 ABS data, the annual value of volunteering in publicly oriented fields was in excess of $1 billion. Of that, $59 million was the estimated value of volunteering in emergency services alone. That is not to say that if the government was to do away with emergency service volunteers, that it would only cost them $59 million. I believe volunteering in our country communities has a bright future, but as policymakers, often we need to remind ourselves of the community's expectations in relation to service delivery, whether it be emergency services or through a host of other volunteer organisations within our community, and the cost benefit to government of having volunteers provide that service. I was in Kalbarri on Monday this week and met with Mr Mac Holt, Deputy Unit Manager of the Kalbarri State Emergency Service. Whilst touring the emergency service facility, which in recent years has received support from Royalties for Regions, Mac explained to me the investment that they are making in their volunteers and how they had grown their membership base from a limited few to a reliable number with succession planning well underway. One area that the government needs to address to relieve some burden on volunteers is the arrangements of non-urgent patient transfer. I attended many of the Southern Inland Health Initiative consultation meetings last year, and the two common issues raised were non-urgent patient transfer and the patient-assisted travel scheme. Our expensive emergency ambulances and our increasingly precious volunteers are becoming burdened with inter-hospital transfers of a non-urgent nature. For a town such as Jurien Bay or Moora, this is taking an emergency response resource as well as a volunteer crew out of town for 5 or more hours. If you were a one-ambulance town, as many are, this would mean, for that length of time, the local emergency response capacity is severely diminished. I'm told this is taking its toll on our ambulance volunteers. I was pleased that the Nationals, during the election campaign, announced an initiative to, in some small way, recognise the work of our emergency service volunteers. A $2,000 fuel card will be provided to each emergency service group in regional Western Australia to recognise their contribution to the community. This card is not intended to fill up the tank in the fire truck. It is to recognise the contribution, and frequently it is a financial contribution that volunteers make to their community. I'd also like to make some comments in relation to the Patient-Assisted Travel Scheme, or PATS as it is commonly known. I'm very proud of the much-needed investment boost of PATS that Royalties for Regions funded when coming to government in 2008. However, the time has come for a more comprehensive review of this program. The line on the map approach as a sole eligibility measure is not providing the safety net that regional people need to access specialist medical care. I met a family living in Bindoon during the election that had 2 disabled children requiring ongoing specialist health care only available in Perth. Bindoon is their home, and more importantly, is where their family is located, which provides them with essential support to care for their children. I was told that on occasion, they travel 3 times a week to Perth for healthcare. Bindoon, being 80 kilometres from the CBD, does not provide this family with PATS eligibility, which is a minimum of 100 kilometres to the nearest eligible medical specialist. Staying overnight in Perth is not an option for this family either. Getting by on a carer's payment, even with PATS eligibility, would only offer them $75 per night towards commercial accommodation. There is no doubt they're doing it tough. The program must be more needs-based and responsive to individual family needs. I appreciate the requirement to have eligibility criteria, but then have some way of allowing the department to provide some discretion in its application based on exceptional circumstances. I'd like to talk briefly about the campaign and make some specific mention of those who provided me with a great amount of support. Firstly, having been involved in several state and federal election campaigns, the role that the West Australian Electoral Commission plays in conducting these enormous logistical operations is not fully recognised in my view. 456 candidates vying for 95 places in the state's parliament, nearly 800 polling places run by 7,500 casual staff. This state government department has only 49 staff, yet performs one of the most important functions of our democracy, the successful operation of our elections. The agricultural region is a big place, and I'd like to acknowledge Paul Brown, Jill Saunis, Kathy Bowen and Rosalba Butterworth. These 4 fine people ran alongside me on the party's ticket, with enormous support from their respective families, I am sure. We had a lot of fun amongst the more serious moments of the campaign. I recall the first door that I knocked on of the campaign was out the back of Bindoon in the country club, catching the resident by surprise as he was taking a leak off the back veranda. I'm not sure who was more surprised or embarrassed. I still left my flyer with him in case he had any questions, not offering a handshake on this occasion, and then continued on my way. Whilst door knocking will always provide you with an endless supply of near misses and funny stories, I continue to find it a valuable tool to receive feedback and engage with my constituents. It was door knocking that gave me the confidence to stare down our detractors, who would suggest the Nationals face devastation in the agricultural region and its assembly districts at this election. Whilst this story was being printed week after week in our rural newspapers, this was not the feedback that I was getting from the community, mostly through my door knocking. Because of my natural association with the northern agricultural region, I find myself spending more time supporting Shane Love in the electorate of Moore. I'd only met Shane a handful of times prior to his pre-selection, including when the Honourable Grant Woodhams and I approached him to run for the Nationals. I'm confident that he'll be an excellent representative for the people of Moore, and I wish Shane all the best for his parliamentary service in the other place. I'd like to recognise the contribution made by the Nationals candidates for the other place to my election: Shane Van Stein in Geraldton, Mia Davies in Central Wheatbelt, and the Honourable Terry Waldron in Wagen. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge some of the people that assisted me personally during the campaign. Firstly, the energy and support provided by the young Nationals was fantastic. Bryn Butler, Cale Hill, Jamie Forsyth, Jake Ash, James Wishart, Douglas Martin and Henry Travers from Sydney, Cameron O'Neill from Brisbane, thank you for your support. To my federal parliamentary colleagues, the Honourable Warren Truss, Senator Barnaby Joyce and Senator Fiona Nash, thank you for the time you spent assisting me during the campaign. I'm sure it's not easy for you to find that time, and I appreciate it. I'd like to acknowledge the support of my amazing family. My mum and dad especially helped me on several fronts: putting up billboards, catering at campaign functions, transporting our team around the electorate. I'm very privileged to have such a supportive family. Polling day is never an easy task, and there are far too many people to mention individually. Friends, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, parents-in-law, as I said, too many to mention, but I would not be here today without all of your hard work on that long, warm day in March. Mr. President, I took your wise advice and have two very, very capable staff supporting me. I'd like to recognise Vanessa Sheehan and Joe Lundy tonight. Whilst we're only a few weeks in, your support for me has been superb. Last but not least, I must save a special mention for my much-loved partner, Dale Spark. I've found many people have offered advice on how to look after one's family whilst in public life, which I must say I have not needed yet. Even through the busy months leading up to the election, when I would not be home for weeks at a time, I knew I had the 100% support of you. You're an amazing person who backs me every inch of the way. I look forward to the next 4 years in this place. I hope that we can tackle some of the big challenges that stand in the way of making Western Australia even greater. I thank the House for its patience.